Okay. Thank you, Colleen, and welcome everyone. Very happy to see you all again today. And it looks like most everybody from the committee itself is in fact online. What I think I will do is just go ahead and go through the members of the committee and just ask you all to say hello, just so we know who's here. And so our other guests also know who's here. So my name is Neil Cameron. I'm Deputy Commissioner, DEC, Chair of this committee. Zach, I believe I see you online.
Yep, Zach Bodgett, City Montpelier.
All right, thank you, Zach. And Luce, I already said hello to you.
Good Hi, Luce Hillman, Town of Shelburne Select Board. We're an MS4, and also I'm civil engineer.
Excellent. Carrie Dolan, are you with us quite yet? Okay, and Christine Doherty, are you joined online today? Christine usually attends in person, so I wouldn't be surprised if she didn't pop in the room here. Lindsay Delorier. Jenny Patterson, I do see you.
Hello, Jenny Patterson, Lake Champlain Committee.
Nice to see you today. Catherine Dimitrick. And Brian Bannon.
Hi, Brian Bannon, Town of Brattleboro.
Welcome. All right, very good. Just on the cusp of a quorum, if I count myself. Very good. We move forward.
Can I just flag something? It says Limestone for the physical location. I was actually just up there. Some folks may be confused.
Oh,
we're obviously here.
Okay.
So I could run up and double check.
That might be good. Yeah, if you don't,
I didn't see anyone else. So
if you don't mind, we can. And when you come back by, ask Bridget to just keep an eyeball out on folks coming through. Okay. So on the agenda today, we'll do a public comment, and we have one person signed up for that. We're going to spend a little bit time doing work group report outs, 5 minutes per report out, something like that. Is that accurate, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay. And then we're going to get into a discussion. Going to revisit our nested egg diagram that we've been using, and Gianna is going to lead us through a conversation about getting really tight focus on which way we want this committee to proceed moving forward into actually drafting, complete recommendations. And then some next steps and wrap up. Are there any questions on the agenda or any recommendations or requests for adding? Right. Very good. Public comment. Claire Ireland, are you with us today?
Hi, Neil. I am. I actually don't have any comments to make today, but thank you for the opportunity. Thanks.
Oh, are you just, I understand you were signed up, right? Fair enough.
Did, okay. But that was more, I never know whether to click that box or not. So I don't have anything specific right now, but thank you so much.
Okay. Well, I ran into your coworker, Michelle, down at the State House earlier today. I'll tell you that. How's that?
Wonderful. Thanks.
Good. Okay. All right. So then let's go ahead and move forward into the work group report outs. And I think Chris and Mary are going to be chapter 1, Christine and Terry chapter 2, and chapter 3 Gianna. So Mary, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. So chapter 1 has
remind us all, including the committee members, who was on those work groups or who was on your work group.
Sure, yeah. We were working with Zach and Catherine Dimitrick and Shane, I think, and Brian Bannon. I think those are the 3 official members. And then Shane Geiger from Shelburne has come to, I think, all of them.
Yep.
Yeah, all of them. Oh, here he is.
We see Shane online in the lower left.
Yeah.
There, so.
And also Senator Harrison has been involved a little bit. I think that's
it too.
Yeah, so we've met several times as a group, and started off also working with Sage from the legal team.
Welcome,
And
Christy.
hello.
Have a seat.
And Sage helped us identify various legal models that we could use either as part of the utility, as to form the utility, or as, a model to kind of base the formation of the utility on. And so Sage wrote of many options from her legal research, and we took some of those ideas and worked through, given these different options, what would be like what's necessary for a utility to form, what would be, beneficial in the formation of a utility, and what are some other priorities or goals that a utility could help achieve. And that those things Gianna summarized in the table in the agenda for chapter 1, and they, the first being what can a utility provide, being like what kind of services would the utility cover, and some big important ones we've talked about are the ability to raise and distribute funds, do regional infrastructure planning, bring significant technical expertise for design, construction, and operations and maintenance of projects, and as well as carry out reporting requirements, inspections, and other permit management related items. And then the second point is what, based on what, those suite of services that the entity would need to provide, what would they be empowered to do? So they would need to be able to collect and set fees and enforce collection of fees. They would need to be able to legally hold permits. They would need some ability to either own or contract out equipment and access to land, and they would need some kind of geographic scope of jurisdiction. And so with those things in mind, there's some, significant considerations. One is around prioritizing existing regional mechanisms. We've, talked about the QUISPs a little bit, talked about RPCs or other county level governance structures, and where those boundaries overlap is would be a central part of how the utility would be formed, and the role that the municipality would play, like how much the municipality would, what part of the equation would the municipality play. So those are some of the key points that we've been discussing. A lot of the options there require input from the whole group, as in terms of the sort of, especially in terms of like the scale and what we're solving for. And those big picture questions have informed a lot of the discussion prompts on today's agenda around what are the goals that we are deciding to really focus on that will impact the formation of the utility significantly. So hopeful that the discussions we have today will give chapter 1 the information we need to move forward. And if anyone else from chapter 1, Chris or any of the members online would like to add to that, please do.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I think a lot of the questions that we're going to get to today are, I don't know if they came just out of chapter 1, but we've talked about some of the questions in chapter 1, like what are we solving for? And it's really hard to take the research that Sage did and advance it until we answer some of those fundamental questions. So we're sort of it's like we're at the right place at the right time. We're here wanting to have to get to the next step. We want to have these conversations, which we can then take to inform more about what we'll be writing in chapter 1.
All right,
which I think is what you said, just saying it in a different way, but yeah.
great. So thank you both. Any comments from members of that work group or other members of the committee or guests? Okay. Christine and Terry, you are reporting out on the second?
Yeah, and we had talked as a group. I left the door open. Christine offered, so if you'd like
Oh,
to, I can
gonna
certainly
lead?
jump in and
Excellent.
contribute. Sure.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of go through and highlight some of the different sections here. So when reviewing the existing statutes and rules and general permit language regarding the ability for a separate entity such as utility to assume permitting obligations, including 3-acre sites. So, what's the opportunities for that? There is some existing regulatory language on the stormwater utilities related to permitting. There will need to be some modifications to existing statutory language if we were to set up a utility. Kind of really goes back to what we were talking about with chapter 1 though, and that's really needing to identify the approach that we want to take, and because that's going to really ultimately lead us back to what changes or amendments might need to happen. But there is some structure there to start with, and then looking at how a regional utility could assume responsibility for permitting of properties and subject to the 3-acre permit. Under the current regulatory language, stormwater utilities assuming responsibility for operational stormwater permits, including 3-acre sites, will need to have permit coverage for impervious surfaces, just as MS4s and other operators do. So I don't think there's a big surprise there, but something that we need to think about is what that permitting framework would look like, because it will likely look a little bit different later on in here, we does talk about how regionalizing these stormwater permits, especially through a watershed-based type of structure or any other regional system, could really have the potential to reduce the administrative burden on the state programs, which would be a benefit. But again, I think to the degree which that burden can be, reduced, particularly relating to permits, is going to depend on what that permit structure looks like. Because right now, you guys obviously review a lot of permit applications. Whether and how regional stormwater utility could improve the management of parcel-based stormwater permitting issues in a more cost-effective and equitable manner. It kind of gets back to what I was just talking about. There's municipalities previously have taken over permitting responsibilities for some operational stormwater permits. So there is some history there, some precedents that's been set in that action. Again, with the MS4s that do that, we already have an MS4 permit. So rolling those systems into our MS4 permit was a pretty clean and easy process. Be great to model something similar with a regional stormwater program. But again, those are kind of some of the details we'd have to work out with your department, with the watershed department, and see what would work best for that.
Question about that real quickly.
Yep.
Is that like a regional MS4 kind of like a RS4 almost?
I guess that
maybe with or without the minimum measures and all the apparatus.
Yeah. I think that'd be the thing. You think you're looking at it in a similar way, ideally, if there was a way to structure it that way, I think it would really reduce a lot of the administrative burdens for the state, for the review processes and things like that, and for the stormwater utility itself, because it's a challenge if you got to manage 60 or 70 individual permits from like renewals and things like that. But if you can, if like an MS4 style permit umbrella can kind of be created to allow these systems to be adopted into it, and that would make sense. But yeah, the obviously the minimum requirements associated with the MS4 permits, I think was not part of the conversation when looking at the, looking at the regional stormwater program approach. So that's still, I think that's still in discussion as to, how do you meet that? And whether or not, what's the nexus for the current MS4s, and can that be relieved, by taking this approach? So I think that's something that has to still be discussed, and I haven't had a chance to connect with Christy Witters on that yet, but I know that there's been some discussions as to what the nexus was for MS4s in today's current permitting structure, because we don't have the population density or the populations,
Right.
the thresholds to really trigger that. So
okay, cool, thank you.
Yep. So I think there's certainly some opportunities in some precedents there that's already been established from local utilities, MS4s incorporating permits. Of course, there would need to be easements and things like that that'd be in place, but I think that's something that's doesn't really take a lot of our time to evaluate. I think that's something that the utility structure itself could figure out how it wants to approach. The streamlining of stormwater permitting for municipalities and others improve the application process, permit renewal fee requirements. Again, just could reduce the number of operational stormwater permits needed, lowers the burden, really for everybody in that aspect. So that's number 4. Permitting implications of regional stormwater management plans managed by regional utility to achieve pollutant reduction measures. This kind of looking at like where the MS4s have phosphorus control plans. And then we also have these watershed, the watershed management plans, which are renewed every 5 years. Those plans really are very comparable to what we already have with phosphorus control plans and flow restoration plans. And so there's a lot of that structures already in place, and a lot of the needs have already been identified or are getting identified through the watershed management plans. And so I think there's an opportunity to streamline, for that streamlining of it. And I'm sorry, number 4 was talking about the streamlining for municipalities and others to improve the application process. That kind of touches on the concerns that have been continually expressed about municipalities having to have a permit for their roads or being a co-permittee. So even though we have a general permit that we manage, we still then end up getting tied to a bunch of individual permits, which can be pretty burdensome to manage and track. So the hope is that with the regional system, the regional or like a regionalized stormwater utility could be relieved of that burden by taking over the system and being responsible for the runoff that's associated with that. I think there's still going to have to be some discussions with watershed A&R.
So the regional entity takes the stormwater from the roads transecting the sites.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But I don't. When suggesting that as a possibility, I think it's good to be clear that it's not transferring any road maintenance or responsibilities to the utility,
It's the
because
balance.
that needs to be maintained locally. But yeah, so number 5 is permitting implications of regional stormwater management plans managed by regional utility to achieve pollutant reduction measures. Yeah, so that's what I was starting to say with the PCPs and the MS4s, and kind of how the watershed management plans can really function in that same way. And I think with that, the idea with that is when we really look at the TMDL itself, there's a lot of the different regions have different contributing waste loads, where the waste loads are coming from, right? So if you look up north, St. Albans Bay, a lot of that's agriculture, not from developed lands. And so having a chasing developed lands across the entire state under a general permit, doesn't necessarily address the concerns for the different watersheds. So the north, north and even south of Burlington, there's some watershed, some lake sections that are not highly impacted by developed lands, and the current 3-acre rule is not going to address those waste loads. And so looking at this more from a regional perspective, I think it would allow those different lake segments to better address the waste load where it's coming from. And the same would be said with, the main lake, Burlington, for example, doesn't really have a high contribution from agriculture or from natural lands, forested lands, or stream bank destabilization. That's where we're seeing high developed land contributions, right? And so the kind of the thought here was that one of the benefits of regionalizing, and our group keeps going back to at a watershed basis, would allow those regions to really focus in on where their phosphorus contributions are coming from more effectively. I think right now the 3-acre rule is a very broad general approach, but when you look at the whole lake we look at the lake as a whole and where things are, where the contributions are coming from, I think it's missing a lot of opportunities. And I know that there's other programs that are working towards things, but we have this program working on this one over here, this one over here. And, this could really help bring it all together and consolidate it, which kind of goes back to those efficiencies. And I would say back to the benefits of it. So what are some of the benefits or incentives for permitting? Again, support less costly, more efficient phosphorus reductions from other maybe less regulated or unregulated developed sites. Being able to look at 3-acre sites with logistical challenges. Maybe you have site constraints, maybe there's no HOA. You'd be able to maybe identify, regional system could really identify different opportunities and that it still could be tied to their contributing category. So sticking with developed lands, if there's no HOA and there's no land dedicated for placing a stormwater treatment practice, then utility would be in a better place. A regional utility would be in a better position to look for other opportunities to get those reductions from developed lands that may not be currently permitted. But when reading through the TMDL, it seems like there was some opportunity for that to happen. Because of the way that it's all categorized as developed lands, it's not the TMDL saying that we have to go after 3-acre sites. It just says developed lands. And so I think this could provide an opportunity to expand our opportunities to get reductions from those from 3-acre sites that maybe are constrained. In other locations, we can get those reductions. And then regional utilities could potentially take over or assist with certain responsibilities of the MS4s. I think that's one of the things, again, that goes back to the conversation I think that needs to be had at large. Is kind of could the MS4s be dissolved if we're able to, if we're able to meet our reductions, our phosphorus loading, and other water quality concerns within these different watersheds. And if not, that's fine. But what did that look like for those MS4s? Because we have a number of them, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for those to be dissolved and concentrating the resources into regional stormwater utilities.
It's provocative.
All right, that's interesting.
Well, I mean, it is like no shade and nothing bad by saying that, but like it is, right? Just because of the duration of time that we've been in that paradigm.
Sure, but when we're looking at that, Neil, and I think the question, there's also the other side of that is that we have a lot of surface waters that are impaired. and if I'm not mistaken, one of the main reasons why the MS4s were set up is to try to address some of these impaired waterways, right? And so when you're looking at what's 107 or so that are impaired, then why did we stop at the 14 MS4s we have? Why don't we have 104 each, MS4s to address all the different impaired waters? I understand they're not all, on the 303D list yet, but that's should be going in that direction, right? So I hear it might be provocative, but the other side of that is it's not being equitable to the communities that are burdened with those programs when other communities don't have to, don't have those obligations, even though they have impaired waters that are, that their lands, developed lands and other potential pollutants are contributing to, right? So
there's good, when we get to Gianna's section of the agenda, what is some of the, where this chapter discussion is weaving around is sort of the scope and scale of what we're talking about here, and which pieces of allocation are we after controlling with a regionalized entity. So Gianna has a really nicely structured way of walking through those questions, but you're definitely touching on them in a number of ways through your presentation. So
wonderful. Happy to hear that.
Yeah. Any last bits and parts?
Just the challenges and disincentives. And the challenges is just one of the big ones is the resources to administer the permitting requirements, right? And because this is, right now we have 14 or so MS4s, and even amongst ourselves, it's sometimes difficult to stay staffed and get our tasks done. And so, how would that, what would it take to get these these regional systems stood up and have the staffing and resources that are required? And then, if extensive offsite approaches are envisioned, the willingness of other unregulated landowners or of non-3 acre sites to allow their lands to host stormwater treatment practices. And that's a lot, that goes back to like the NIMBY idea, which is, inevitably going to be a challenge. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Christine? Luce, go ahead.
Hi, we also discussed our regional aspect of being able to prioritize which sites would reduce the most phosphorus. And Jenny's nodding her head. And so to me, that would be an advantage when you have a regional utility, is that they can look at all for instance, the 3 acre sites, and we don't have enough money to do them all from state funding. So which ones will give us the biggest value or closest to our target would seem like they should be prioritized, and you get away from each municipal utility trying to get money for their project so they can have, say we're done.
Danny, go ahead.
Yes, and just echoing, I think I always also remember this group, and I think we did have a lot of conversation that I think will be well addressed by the discussion prompts that we're going to talk about. But the idea of having a framework that would enable the regional utility itself to be setting priorities, to be addressing situations kind of in order of kind of importance and having phased implementation, I think is going to be really helpful. And I do think the decision prompts address that.
Okay, any other questions? Terry, did you want to add anything as being co-presenter on this?
In the interest of time, but if we get into further discussion.
Okay, we will on the back end of the agenda for sure. So
maybe group 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, sorry, wrong document. Yeah,
I'm
so
happy to take chapter 3.
Oh, I was just looking to see who was going to lead that. So Gianna, off you go.
Yeah, I don't think I have Carrie or Lindsay here today. So I will represent the team. We did have Daniel from Winooski Conservation District join us for one of the breakout meetings as well. We met twice after the January work group meeting, so 3 times total. And this chapter is focused on opportunities for regional level revenue raising. And just some highlights to draw your attention to. A lot of the discussion from this group was about the interplay of state and regional funding, and really seeing, trying to find ways and opportunities to lean in on existing revenue raising mechanisms, and fully vetting and exploring if there is a need for regional fundraising, it's to fill a gap, and what is that gap? And so this outline, you might see there's sort of a heavy focus on how the state currently revenue raises, the volume it revenue raises, and how it distributes those funds, how it prioritizes those funds, and what are the benefits to accessing that money, and what are the challenges to accessing that money. And just trying to get a bit more at is that framework for how the state is funding regulatory stormwater through loans, through grants, appropriate for the state's share, sufficient for the state's share. What is the gap that a regional entity would try to revenue raise for? There's certainly some discussion in the outline on revenue raising mechanisms, but there's tons of research out there on the different ways that an entity can, raise through taxes, through fees, through special assessment districts, et cetera. And so it's light on that in the outline, really maybe expecting to point to existing literature in that space, but maybe give a brief summary of some of the different fee design options. Impervious surface per parcel, some of the really basics of that. And Carrie had suggested maybe putting a little table in the outline of like, these are the different fee structures, and here are the sort of factors it achieves, whether it's equity, nexus, and sort of showing maybe the different fee structures and the pros and cons of that based on what we're trying to achieve with revenue raising. We did talk a little bit and want to have space in this chapter to talk about how fee relief or fees can be designed to incentivize hosting practices as one way to address this lack of access to land. And so trying to think about how the fee structure gives access of the utility to incentivize sites to host practices on their land. There's certainly the interplay with this in chapter 1 about how the scale of the entity that's formed and what that means for how it can bill and the ability to bill and revenue raise. And I know chapter 1 talked a little bit about sort of partnering with municipalities and the municipal tax bill and then kind of passing on money. So different creative ways to do that, but similar to other chapters, we circled around a lot about what are we raising, who's doing the revenue raising, who's in, who's out. And so really hoping that the discussion that we've set up for today will help all of these chapters in that space. And then maybe some core recommendations that we've discussed coming out of this chapter so far is a lot of the literature when it comes to establishing new fees is the need for public will and engagement, and being able to articulate that in this chapter. Potentially the idea of regionally specific designs in fee management or some way to otherwise get the public and local public will involved in there. And certainly there are lots of experts out there in launching new fees and revenue raising and the public communications that goes along with that. So really engaging with them to launch something like this. And again, evaluating, I think in this space and maybe also similar to chapter 1, how much can we lean in on what already exists out there, both in terms of an entity, in terms of the relationships, in terms of the revenue raising, and what are the gaps that we need to fill in creating new revenue raising mechanisms. So not necessarily an answer, but maybe more questions there. So happy to take questions from anyone on that chapter.
All right. Questions for Gianna? Gianna, I have one for you. The last time we met, so this is under the category of like, how do you collect fees, right? Or how would one collect fees? And I'm not sure if your meetings came after or preceded our last full meeting of this committee. But one of the things that really caught my ear from the Southeast, from the SEMSWA presentation, was their relationship with the municipalities, so that the municipalities through their tax bills are catching the fees and then porting them over to the utility. And that seems super elegant to me. I don't know for those who represent municipalities whether it seems elegant to you or not, but it did seem to get around a whole host of challenges like non-payment, enforcement, going after people all.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I know you had mentioned it, and I know that it sounds very similar to what chapter 1 was envisioning too, this sort of partnership between municipalities and a regional entity. And we don't have it on the agenda for today. We have sort of a very long list of core questions for the committee, but one really was sort of the role of the municipality in this dynamic. Maybe about a third of 3-acre sites are municipally owned and 2/3 are not. And we certainly have seen the engagement of a municipality, whether they're a co-permittee or an MS4, not really involved with a 3-acre site, or just other municipalities, like a range of willingness to engage with a private site. And so I think that's really a nut to crack, and something when we talk about what are we solving for, where the municipality is baked in as being part of this, part and parcel, and where
Yep.
it's an opt-in versus opt-out.
Right.
Question.
Right. Absolutely. I'm falling prey to the exact same thing that all of us are as we ideate. Like, where are we in the Venn
It's okay,
diagram
it's
and in the
hard.
egg diagram? Exactly. Shane.
Yeah, Neil, I just wanted to say this. I thought of this as well. It was interesting from the SEMSWA billing that they didn't bill the municipality, the Centennial, whatever the municipality was. Like in Shelburne, every private property pays a stormwater fee, and the town pays a stormwater fee based on the town's impervious. So in our scenario, our utility is paid for by both private property, stormwater fees, and technically taxes, because the municipality is paying the utility for its share. So I thought that was interesting how they didn't do that.
Okay.
Just an interesting thing I noticed. Yeah.
Luz?
Yeah, I just wanted to say not all municipalities have utilities, right? Like, didn't Montpelier just vote against having a stormwater utility? I think, Zach, is that what you had told us? So would you be forcing municipalities to create a utility for the billing? I don't know, just something to think about.
Yes. So can I respond to that?
Go ahead, Zach. Yeah, please.
So
go ahead.
in Montpelier specifically, we were all for implementing. It was the process of how to get the bill successfully through, because the way that NIMRIC is set up with utility billings, it's not, you can only have one workbook. So we would have had to wipe out everything that was already in the system and provide a whole new set of, basically reformat everything, which is, that task was where we stalled out. It wasn't that we didn't want to do it. It was, how do we physically implement the billing piece, and then getting over, because we have water billings, we have sewer billings, and there's nothing to tie them to one individualized parcel. They're just in a random account that exists somewhere else. So we would wipe that clean, base it off of like a span or a grand list number, and then have an extra decimal point with a 1 if you had a water, 2 if you had a sewer, 3 if you had a stormwater. So that way, however many utilities you had, it would all be in a uniform, logical billing cycle. So we figured out how to do it. We just didn't have the capacity to make that happen.
Okay, but
Gotcha.
not all municipalities have utilities, stormwater utilities.
Correct.
So
Right.
do you require them to have one because we need billing that can then pay a region?
That's interesting, Luz. I mean, I heard, so let's pretend SEMSWA had like 60 municipalities as opposed to 2 really big ones, right? Their intermunicipal agreements could be that, they calculate and assign the per parcel impervious fee the municipality collects that and gives it to SEMSWA. SEMSWA then covers all of those requirements, and municipality does nothing else with those stormwater pieces. That was the piece that I cottoned onto, but we can get into the details of it. I'm sure we will as we move forward here.
Right, you need to keep a piece of the stormwater fee for the local maintenance of the roads. Or it's tricky on who's going to maintain some of the structures that are related to stormwater. Is it going to be the local town that cleans out the detention ponds, or is it going to be the region? Where's that line of maintenance going to be drawn?
Yep. Gianna, you have your work cut out for you because all of these pieces and parts are inside of your part of the agenda there.
Approach.
I saw Caroline. I saw your hand up. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but just from South Burlington's kind of perspective, as you all know, or not all, but as some of you know, we do have a utility. And I just wanted to note that we do very explicitly have it not as a property tax. It is a fee. And that is kind of part and parcel to what gained us the goodwill of our residents when we kind of established that. So just kind of a highlight that if that was going to be wrapped in, we'd want to make sure that how we frame that kind of collection does have a big difference on local goodwill.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good discussion, and thank you to the teams that have invested in getting those outlines together, because there's a lot there. Okay. So the next section of our agenda really kind of deals with some of the things that I've already heard in our conversation today. Like, are we trying to, Luce, you're referencing the roads, and are we trying to cover roads in addition to non-municipal sites? And Christine, big provocative idea of dissolving the MS4s and instead embedding all of that responsibility into some regional entity, right? Those are all scalar expressions of what these regional utilities could be. So one of the things that we've definitely been hearing kind of as a part of our regular tempo through these meetings to date is like this difference of not opinion, but these different ideas as to scale. And what is the problem we're trying to solve for? Are we trying to deal with that component of the waste load allocation that is the 3 acre? Are we trying to deal with the waste load allocation? Are we trying to deal with phosphorus? Just to simplify it. And so Gianna has kind of put together a really nice and detailed outline to prompt our thinking on how we can kind of structurally make a decision as to which way we want to go with that. So Gianna, if I framed that properly, I would turn it over to you to walk us through what you put together.
You framed that great. Thanks, Neil. I put in the chat a relink to this discussion prompt, and at the top of it is really the staging or some of the reflections DEC had putting this together. And so I'll talk through them briefly just to reset the stage for everyone, but we really appreciate everyone's time and participation in the work groups and outlines to date, and are sensing that we're kind of at a point now where we need to then step back from the outlines and revisit some of this. So that's sort of why we're having this discussion. We've noticed that people are really coming to the table with different goals, and so revisiting this nested diagram might be helpful to figure out what we're trying to solve for in what order. And not necessarily that things have to be off the table, but can we set a priority and a phasing? And so there seems to be there's a lot of these different ways we could do this and opportunities to layer on complexity. In the revenue raising chapter, it was start simple and then layer on as your ability to map impervious improves, so there's different examples of ways to layer it on over time. Also potential for hybrid solutions. There might be scenarios where a municipality does want to be involved in the billing and another scenario where they don't. And so trying to think about how do we build something that is flexible for those different needs? How do we build in opportunities for local engagement? Where does it make sense for statute to really define something like a new permitting regional MS4 entity? And where does it make sense to allow for that local engagement? And really, I think we're also struggling with this clarity of who's in and who's out, who can participate in a utility, who must participate in utility, and who cannot walk away from their 3-acre site and participate in utility. And so I think we don't we don't have answers for that necessarily of the ideal answer, but we all probably have different opinions on those things. And so just naming that. And then heard from a couple groups really just this desire for the less of hypothetical and more sort of, can we stress test something? Can we see what's feasible? I think, Jenny, you were really asking that in chapter 2 when we talked about the pink, right? Like the other developed lands out there, and you're asking, well, how much is that? And Luce, you're just asking today, like, what would you do if you build does municipality have to have a stormwater utility, et cetera, et cetera? And so what we're hoping or maybe proposing out of this meeting is that DEC takes some more of the guidance that you've already provided us in the outlines and today's discussion and put forth 2 or 3 potential models just to get some reactions to, just to like make it more tangible and say, here's model 1. Hypothetically, this is how it revenue raised. This is how the permit would be structured. This is how it, and so just to get a bit more skin on the bone for people to react to and test these questions about what does feel equitable, what does feel cost effective, and what do we mean by those terms. So that's what we're proposing. And we really want to, we have as we mentioned, a suite of core questions like, what is the role of municipality? What do we mean by equitable? But we thought today, the biggest question is, what are we solving for? And so that's what this table is. And after building the table, realized it was kind of just an expanded version of the nested egg diagram we started with. And so for reference, at the very bottom of this document is the nested egg diagram. But also people were talking about things that maybe we characterize as principles. So on page 2, we tried to tease out what are bigger picture principles like equity, cost effectiveness, simplicity, and nexus, and maybe those are like how we want to get there. We want to make sure we're doing it in an equitable way, a way that's simplest and stuff, and try to tease those out from like, what are the actual problems we're solving for? And so then the table, just for reference for reading, it's got all the way on the left is potential phases. And this is all up for discussion where these things fall, but this is sort of us DEC proposing like what we feel either based on urgency or magnitude, maybe we'd solve for first, and then explore phasing in over time. Highlighted in yellow is what we would try to solve for that site condition, and then bolded is like what we're really solving for, if that makes sense. Really extra. And so it starts really with 3-acre sites that already have permitted designs, and they're like, okay, now what? And then it's 3-acre sites that maybe are working their way through design, maybe aren't quite there yet. This is the space where I think we've talked a lot about that cost effectiveness opportunity of finding maybe doing the projects not on that land. Where's that developed land opportunity? So I think that's where this kind of lands. Then we talk about potentially sub 3-acre sites that have their own obligations for a tight timeline that Act 37 said we could fund, that need to do retrofits as well. Then we have sort of in 4 this stuff that's like maybe not as hard a deadline, but would be really nice to have. 3-acre sites that already have practices implemented. Municipal sites that have aging stormwater. Simplifying these duplicative or layered permits. All of this would really serve for technical assistance and fundraising. And then we put under 5 stuff that would take a lot more work or felt like it was addressed elsewhere. And this is where right now we've couched the bigger picture waste load allocation trading, like finding across a full watershed versus just developed lands and what that might mean. Or are we solving for bigger picture questions like flood resilience, climate resilience, other benefits as well, because that has been brought up. So I hope that just gives you a brief run through of how to read the table if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it. And our questions to you all, and certainly we can go beyond these questions, but are really just 2. maybe three. Maybe there's two questions in the first one. Reflecting on the conversations we've been having to date for the last few months and your participation in these chapter work groups, what do you think you've been trying to solve for? Do you think that's reflected somewhere, either in the table or the principles or not? Is there something that you've been trying to solve for that's not otherwise here? And are you comfortable with this order? Or would you reorganize in terms of urgency or magnitude? And then the hope is that we can take this guidance from you guys and say, okay, we propose this, here's 3 models or 2 models, and this is how phase 1 would work for this model. This is how it then would solve for phase 2 and then would solve for phase 3 or something like that.
Gianna, when you say phase 1, 2, 3, can you kind of just contextualize that a little bit more? Like in your mind, you're either seeing a set of temporal steps or a set of incrementally larger jurisdictions or so. So what are you thinking there?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking temporally, right? So if you know, for example, DEC is really looking at these sites that have permits and plans as top priority because it's slightly over half of the 3-acre parcels, maybe more as more are getting permitted. They really need money to get things on the ground. They have designs that we can take advantage of for phosphorus reduction. And so that feels like a higher priority for DEC to solve for in the short term. And what that looks like, how we find the money in the short term, how we disperse that in the short term, might not look the same way a regional utility looks 5 years later. Once it's matured, maybe that first short term is like, maybe one model as the state gives a quick infusion. And then the next phase of solving the bigger problem is the fees on the water bill or something. So kind of the structure of how it can grow over time could be responsive to the priorities from the committee.
Okay. Jenny, go ahead.
So thank you for putting this together. I think it's really helpful, and I particularly like the highlighting and looking at what the areas of focus would be for the different categories of sites. One thing I liked was the magnitude column and what percentage of sites it represents. I'm wondering if there's a way to reflect kind of the amount of actual pollution coming from the sites as well. So that's another way of measuring magnitude and whether the phasing might be different with the different factor in terms of magnitude.
That's a great question, Jenny. And I think that maybe goes to the core of this, right? In terms of, are we providing cost relief, like cost burden relief? Or so the immediacy or urgency of needing to spend money versus layering on a water quality benefit is like at the core of some of this push-pull.
Liz?
Right, I agree with everything like Jenny said. What, you know, again, we're talking about in our subcommittee, the biggest value for the dollars spent, right? And it's based on how much phosphorus is getting removed out of these 370 sites. Which ones are really worth putting the funding into. And I also look at this, it's almost like a 2-part problem that we have. We have this transitional problem now where these 3-acre sites were, you know, a lot of people were surprised they don't have HOAs or legal entities. But then in the future, we know everything from here forward will have a stormwater permit for a new development, for instance, and there will be an HOA or some kind of legal entity to solve that. So we almost have 2 problems, right? We have the problem of 3-acre sites that needed to have their permit renewed and also 3-acre sites that never had a permit, but going forward, and it's a different situation for newly permitted sites, it should be a little easier, right? So this is, to me, it looks like a transition, but the transition could last 10, 20 years, right? As we get there, so.
Yeah. I would like to go back to your question, Jenny, and just sort of for context. And I saw a couple of videos come live. So I was, if anybody has a question, please raise your hand. The team's hand. There's kind of like 2 sets of magnitudes in terms of nutrients in this table. your magnitude associated with 3-acre sites with permitted designs or those yet to be permitted, right? That's all part and parcel of that component of the waste load allocation associated with the 3-acre permit. You know, so it could be very small or it could be up to 15% of the waste load allocation in a place like the direct to Lake Champlain urbanized areas. You know, so that's the magnitude. So not a ton of kilograms versus when you get down to row 5, when you're getting into stormwater infrastructure and especially when you layer in MRGP, now you're picking up big chunks of the waste load allocation in there. You're essentially picking up, frankly, all of the waste load allocation that's not tied up in wastewater discharges. So it's almost like this scalar jump in magnitude of nutrient that you're trying to control. Okay, back to you, Jenna.
I don't think I have more. I've asked the questions. Maybe just open the floor to people's reaction to that. What do they feel like they've been trying to solve for or looking to solve for? And where does it land here in the table?
Great. Would you like to go? I turned around to look at you, Christine, because I know where you're going. I think I know where you're going. So go ahead. I mean, like, just state it, right?
Yeah, I think this the overarching goal is to address the 3-acre burden, the capital burden of it, and the cost and the equity of it, because there's a small number of property owners or HOAs that are that are being burdened by millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and that really feels unfair to a lot of people. The challenge, though, is when you start to unpeel that layer back, then where do you capture that then, right? And so inevitably, if you want to break down the 3-acre rule to try to capture that reduction somewhere else, then you have to start looking at the next problem, which is all the other sites, some of them that are not permitted and some of them that are permitted in developed lands. And so I think the big goal started with 3 acres, but if you want to actually address that, you have to kind of open things up a little bit further to try to find a solution.
So reading it back to you, the nutrient load we're trying to achieve is the nutrient load associated with the 3-acre sites. The means and methods is by expanding beyond those across the waste load allocation, or alternately wrapping sites that are not presently in the waste load allocation and putting them in a permit, basically, and capturing them.
Yeah, I guess I don't see the 3 acres. I don't see the waste load allocations for the 3-acre sites as necessarily the only concern there, because I think that larger concern is is to really go back to the phosphorus, the TMDL for Lake Champlain and meeting that goal, right? And that's the goal. The 3 acres is just one small part of that, and I think that it's just really looking outside of that and how do we get it? And if we can find a way to reduce it. Reduce phosphorus from not just the 3-acre sites, but from, maybe more equitable across more developed lands, right? Whether that is roads, maybe it's, maybe it's smaller impervious sites or sites with impervious, maybe, there's not an answer there yet.
Right.
Yeah, but the waste load allocation from developed lands as a whole, but I think it's the burden of 3-acre, because it's so, it's just, I think it caught a lot of people off guard, even though it started talking about it back in 2016. So I think that's where we landed, but.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Jenny, were you going to comment on that, or are you going to give an answer to the question?
Oh, I don't know, maybe both.
Cool. Please do.
So I think there's a complexity, there's a real 3D element to this analysis, because I think when you look at cost effectiveness and the actual phosphorus reduction in creating a new infrastructure, you also are imposing costs. There's kind of the transaction costs, there's the creating the legislation, creating the entity, persuading entities to take on the obligation. And so those are also costs. And so I think that it is really complicated. And I do like the idea of looking watershed by watershed and having an understanding of what are the big contributors within that segment. And you can do that, looking at the clean water tables under the TMDL and the clean water report. That being said, looking at the concentric circle diagrams, I think you add a lot of levels of complexity as you get to the outer levels. And the idea of reopening the TMDL, and in particular, moving across sectors that have very different regulatory schemes. And so having a model that creates a mechanism that's analogous to the MS4, even if it doesn't involve municipalities in the same way, might be kind of the happy medium. It's kind of midway in the concentric circles in terms of having entities that have the capacity to deal with a particular type of source of pollutants. That maybe in the middle there makes the most sense. I think it's hard when you look at agriculture. It can be very, very appealing to say, look, well, this is the biggest contributor within this particular watershed, but the complexity of the agricultural regulations and the agricultural solutions makes it less feasible than, say, putting in roads and wastewater and develop plans into the same bucket. So that might make more sense and might reduce the need to actually alter the TMDL.
Okay. I'm thinking through a way to read it back to you, but I won't just yet. I'll go to Catherine because your hand is up.
You can finish your thought on that, Neil.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm still pondering. Go ahead.
So I think what's missing for me in this table is that I think overarching question that Jenny was just starting to speak to, which is the magnitude of effort and who is doing the effort versus the problem that's being solved. And that came up a lot in our chapter 1 conversations, and I think is missing from this table. I'm not sure how to add that complexity in here, but I think it's an important question that we need to be considering.
I want to offer that that's the kind of thing that might not neatly fit in the table that Gianna is presenting now, but could in the models that might be developed to propose back to everyone. Like this one could be easier because of these things. This one might be really hard because of these things, but achieve X much more.
And I think it's important to be paying attention to who is doing the work and who is paying the cost, and also always keep the status quo as one of the options. Because we need to measure every possible solution against the current state. And if the amount of work of any solution isn't worth the improvement you get from the current state, we shouldn't be doing it.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Shane?
Yeah, I would definitely echo, Catherine and I had that discussion in the chapter 1 groups, and I think that's a very good thing to be keeping in mind. Just going to the questions for discussion, especially that first one, from my perspective, it's been from the efficiency standpoint of, enabling the highest phosphorus reductions for the lowest dollars, and also providing that assistance and ability to do that in the most effective way. Because, from my perspective in Shelburne, we're probably got to be the top 5 most highly funded stormwater utilities in the state, 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there. And even we as a staff of 2, you know, the challenges of keeping up with our MS4 permit is substantial. And we're trying to provide the most assistance to the 3-acre sites in Shelburne and to relieve that burden from them. But even still, the challenges at the scale that we are, and for that to have to be replicated in a small scale over and over and over, you know, this is a Vermont staple. But just having an entity that can be a larger scale and implement things, really reduce costs, operate in a nonprofit manner. You know, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and focusing on the watershed scale of, okay, what are the real needs of each watershed, and focusing and prioritizing funds for those, again, to get the most bang for your buck. And I think, you know, John, I think this is a pretty good map, and I think the phasing prioritization makes sense. So yeah, but that's just been my perspective of what I've been keeping in mind.
Okay. Other thoughts, Gianna?
I just wanted to report back out chapter 2, Jenny, I know the pink and the red question that we are working on that. And so we have great colleague over in the stormwater program, Emily Shelley. She might be on the call today, not to call her out. Has a lot of really great data. It's not plug and play. We need to sort of look at it and figure out the best way, when hearing from quite a few of you wanting to solve for like the most bang for your buck and the most cost-effective opportunity, but really wanting to know what are the other developed lands opportunities and how much, like, what is the landscape of opportunity there, and finding a way to quantify and present that as a story to you all by watershed. And so that's what we've been working on, and huge shout out to Emily for the data she's provided. And that's hopefully what we'll be able to bring back in terms of line 2 in this table, under the assumption that like that universe of other opportunity may not be infinite. And so that's kind of why line 2 separates out from line 1, with the hope that the sites that are already permitted, and maybe not all of them, but a good portion, it's feasible to implement on that site. It's designed and permitted to implement on that site. Let's focus on getting them the money to implement on that site. And maybe some it's still not feasible, but it's not it's not likely that all 675 sites will find somewhere else to do a project. And so that's sort of why we've sort of separated it out in this table, right? And so table item 1 is really like, let's do what we can where there's been permitted opportunities and designed opportunities, and let's still address the cost effectiveness where like sites have been struggling, because they're likely struggling for the feasibility reasons and for the lack of HOAs and for co-permitting, you know, issues. And so for all of that, like, this is probably the space where it makes sense to lean in and provide that flexibility. But anyway, I'll just say that we're hoping to be able to tell that story a bit more for this committee in the coming month or so.
So adding on to that, Gianna, just want to amplify a point I heard you make, Luce, which I think was a good one, right? So for these sites that are permitted, you're right. So we know they're permitted, they're feasible, or, you know, if they're not, the impact fees have happened, but, you know, let's presume they're feasible.
Most have been, really. So
right. So it's a bird in the hand, right? It's like, we know we're going to get the reductions if we build these projects. So I think if we are building this structure that allows us to look elsewhere, it's worth examining that universe of 300 sites. Are there any, Luce, to your point, that are just stupidly expensive, right? Before in making the investment, especially if the investment becomes our investment as opposed to that landowner's investment. But even most acutely, if it becomes that landowner's investment, right? So I think there's something in the scenario or the model that captures that idea, that as we increment our way through the remaining 300 sites, we're going to have more and more granular information over what those sites are worth nutrient wise, reduction wise, and cost wise, right? And then like we can really have that. That's operating with much higher power information than right here and now.
And then you have a cost efficiency ratio for every site.
Basically.
And you can put them on a spectrum, and you could, maybe you'll see a sharp line where you could say, these are the efficient ones and these are not.
Yep. Liz?
And just being careful if that's how we end up, doing the work, prioritizing, not to punish the ones that had a very high cost and low nutrient because they don't get the funding to do the project. Do you know what I mean? Like,
we got to figure that out for sure.
right. We got to figure that out because they
Yeah.
can't be, hey, you could have gotten a grant and gotten your work done, but you're only saving a little bit of phosphorus, reducing a little bit of phosphorus. And we don't
Right.
want to put a lien on their house because they weren't given the grant. So just how we're going to deal with that.
Yeah. And I'm also mindful within the scenario building, I'm mindful of the sites that have not only, permitted, but constructed, because there are some. Right. And so they paid. And if we're coming into some new schema that allows a broader slice of the public to pay for the overall chunk of phosphorus associated with this chunk of the waste load allocation, that equity issue needs to be looked at.
We need to know which ones had grants to do the projects and which ones didn't.
That we have an idea. I think we know that.
Yeah.
Our department, I may not have all the data, but
no, but
some
generally speaking,
some of us do have enough.
Yeah. Jenny.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting discussion, and it almost makes me think you want to focus first on the line twos, because by focusing on the line twos, you start to understand some examples of how this might play out in practice, which is not to say like stop right there on somebody who's building who had a grant to build, but maybe looking at the category ones to see which ones might be best to pause and then see what's the best solution, most equitable, cost-effective solution for this site, which might or might not be construction, depending on how the scenarios play out with the category twos.
Right. Well, I mean, they think that's part of the elegance in Act 37. Check me if I'm wrong, where we got, the extension by 5 years of the construction deadline. Right. So it gives people time, not only to fundraise, but it gives us time to, and correct me if I'm wrong.
We did that. They extended it to 2028 for permitting, and then we just followed suit.
Okay. All right.
To make this make sense.
Yeah.
And build out the implementation.
So the thing is, that's elegant because the more people we get through the NOA or notice the NOI and get them permitted, the more information we have before we start, running into construction. And yet at the same time, there's an incentive for some of the sites to construct right now because there's money in them. Think manufactured housing communities and ARPA recipients.
And I think, you wouldn't want to not spend that money if it's all set to go. I think the question that may be important down the line is the operation and maintenance. And so if you can learn some lessons in the category twos about how to more effectively make sure that the operation and maintenance actually happens so that what you build is actually working and making the reductions, that might be where you come in. So it's permitted, it's being built, there's money to build it, you go ahead and do that. But then you look and say, okay, is there any way that we can actually improve this from a water quality perspective using the lessons that we learned in the category twos?
Yeah, and O&M isn't on the chart.
It's like in 4, I think.
Okay.
Already, it's row 4 is for sites already implemented.
Okay. Thanks.
Which is important because you only book those reductions if the sites are maintained. Are there
just a quick comment to that?
Go ahead.
I think that's where there's, when we really look at where do we want this to land, at the local town level or, the regional, watershed level or state, where do we want to land? The O&M is a huge part of that. And it's not just that, it's the people that are like know about or aware about it. Most HOA board members don't really know anything about maintaining stormwater systems. Not a lot of contractors know what they need to go out there and look for and do. I mean, they could work with engineers, but I think the way that it is right now, it's like a mosaic of knowledge and experience and capabilities. And so again, I guess for another reason why I really support the watershed basis level, and having entity that actually understands stormwater, can really say, okay, help get these systems on maintenance programs, and understand how to set the funding aside for that, and build out those capital improvement, project funds and maintenance funds and things like that. I think that even if we get all these HOAs and all these 3-acre sites set up, I think the next significant challenge is going to be the maintenance of them.
Yeah. I mean, there's an elegance to the way the QUIS program previews that, right? And anticipates that over time, more and more formula grant going to service providers will be for O&M as opposed to originating new projects.
Right.
So this is, to take somewhat of a page from that book.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other issues that folks are wanting to solve for that haven't been aired? Before I ask Gianna, if you're feeling like you have what the team needs.
I'll say that this is one really helpful conversation to listen in on. And if we do have time, the team has other core questions that I'm happy to jump to, but want to fully flesh this out and ask Terry, Mary, and Chris also your thoughts if you have other questions in this first one of what more we'd like to hear if we're building out some scenarios.
I want to call out what's lower in priority in your list, Gianna. And I think one of the things that you've put near the bottom is, or even off the table, is MRGP.
Oh yeah, there's yes,
and then there's the waste load versus load allocation conversation, which keeps coming up, but it's at the bottom of the list. So while we're focusing on the glorious glowing object at the top of the list, which is great, the shiny, whatever, 1,000 points of light, whatever, take your metaphor from
thank you,
30 years ago.
Bush.
I want to focus
way back when.
Yes, the points that are, I think, also probably going to be of interest to committee members. Yeah. So those are two that stuck out for me, because we've definitely come across the waste load versus load allocation conversation in almost every chapter 1 meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can speak a little bit to that, because I appreciate you bringing that up. So when reading through the TMDL, there are certain regions that, have higher waste loads that are associated with the roads, right, versus other regions. And like north and the south, when it comes to developed lands, the roads are the primary phosphorus contributors. And then, it kind of changes a little bit when you come more main lake. With roads, though, in local communities, there's, I think, through, your local public works departments and road maintenance crews, there is a little bit more of a knowledge base there, and an understanding that I think can be leaned on, where we don't have that same knowledge and experience in programs with your commercial sites develop, you know, your commercial properties or your HOAs and those kind of, you know, those developed lands. And so I think that I don't want to I don't want to dismiss the importance of getting reductions from roads and from municipalities, but I think that that actually will probably be an easier long-term matter to manage and maintain and address through like education, grant funding, you know, working with like Vermont local roads and, you know, providing some grant funds that you guys have been in the past. I see the big challenge with like the 3 acres. It's that knowledge, it's the experience, it's the what do we do, who does it, who's responsible for it. Because I feel a lot of those calls. I don't know anything about stormwater, right? And what do I do? Can't you guys do this for me? You know, and so yeah.
So it's interesting that Chris, you bring MRGP up. I've been giving it thought in 2 frames. Because I've heard you before, Christine, too, about this matter, right? And we've talked about it internally. So MRGP needs to be funded, like municipalities need to be able to pay for it, and local roads gives formula awards out and it doesn't meet the need, right? And then the flood comes along and and then in the other frame, or so let me finish with that. So in that context, like of it costs a municipality money, is there elegance to a municipality thinking about a utility structure, forget whether it's regional or not, but a utility structure assessing a per unit area impervious fee in order specifically to fund MRGP? Mostly because if you're going to get to your house, you have traversed the road to get there, right? So there's sort of a fairness there. And that way you're taking it off the property tax grand list and you're making it a little more transparent to Carolyn Foley's comment that she made, right? About like it being called out there or the other frame that I'm thinking of is, yeah, the road crews know their roads and they've got the machinery. Are there other aspects of that? And I don't know if the question is a yes or no. Are there other aspects of MRGP implementation that could be efficiently handled by not the road crew in order to help the road crew focus on the actual road work? Knowing full well that MRGP practices are yellow machines driven by public works road grader peeps, right? But are there pieces and parts? So those are the 2 areas where I think MRGP could be part of the conversation.
Yeah, I certainly think there needs to be a lot more funding.
Yeah.
You know, for MRGP. There needs to be a lot more funding for roads in general. I think I'd get a little concerned though when we start to use utility money for, you know, road infrastructure or I just want to make sure that it would have to stay separate. I don't know. You're kind of getting into like how we get funding for our road maintenance, right? And where that funding comes from and the priorities of it. And yeah, I mean, I would be hard pressed to hear anybody in my community say that the ditch line is more important than the road surface itself.
Yep.
And the cost of maintaining road surface right now is so high.
Another piece to kind of have in mind with MRGP is it's not the entire road network. It's the hydrologically connected.
Right.
Not that you're going to have different people doing different stuff, but like the overall road need is greater than the MRGP need.
Right.
So I guess that was a little bit of a digression.
I think Zach.
Neil, Zach can't raise his hand.
All right.
But he wants.
Okay.
I think he wants to say something.
Yeah, Zach, please go ahead. I'll stop.
Yeah. So one of the things that we had talked about in chapter 1 is that if you take a step back and look at it, everybody's dealing with these issues, right? And everyone is either bucketed into a municipal roads general permit or an MS4 community. So if you look at regionalization, everybody could fall into a bucket where they are being addressed in some fashion, right? And so I will speak for a community that is a municipal roads general permit, right? There are a lot of pieces to that that are difficult to manage, right? Getting to outfalls in very obscure locations. So when we're thinking about addressing the problem, I think if we were to create a regional utility that basically bucketed everybody in the state, whether there was by watershed or district, whatever, it seems like you have a more equitable approach. Everyone would pay into the system. You could then use resources that were more equitable in terms of management. I hear that smaller communities are struggling with your complying with municipal roads general permit. I know that we are, and we're a bigger community. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think Chris was touching upon that from our perspective. I think, the framework is there. Everybody could be regionalized, and what that means and what people's commitment levels are. Maybe they're just part of their portion of the municipal the utility is complying with the municipal roads general permit. Maybe there's a portion that they have individual utilities at the local level. I just wanted to highlight that because that was something that we had been talking about in the chapter 1.
Excellent. I want to, if the committee will permit me, I want to just sort of introduce a topic, and then I'll pull way back from it really quick before we get into deep discussion on it. But just to sort of flag, Chris, you kind of mentioned load allocation versus waste load allocation, right? The idea of going into sub-jurisdictional sites in order to offset the waste load allocation requirements assigned to 3 acre basically is going over to the load allocation and saying, I want some of your phosphorus. And I just want to introduce that what it necessarily means is that by going to that sub-jurisdictional site and saying, I want some of your phosphorus, you're putting it under a permit. Because by putting it under a permit, you're locking in those nutrient reductions. To some of us, that might be really obvious, but to others, not as much. And it gets to the broader concept of trading. And trading isn't necessarily simple. And I wish Carrie were here because I know this is a topic that's near and dear to her. But one of the biggest barriers to trading is the fact that every site that you trade into that's on the load allocation side becomes a site that becomes permitted. So we have to lock it in under a NIPD's permit or a state permit in order to hold the nutrient reductions as, obtained. So I'm just sort of throwing it out there, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But as we think broadly about these things looking forward, it is what that means when we go after smaller sites.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up that Christine was talking about something that kind of got me thinking about landowners and their knowledge base, or even municipal officials. I think a utility could serve a role, or utilities plural, in simply education and outreach. I mean, utilities themselves are probably not going to have the capacity and the staffing to manage the entire state's various stormwater systems. But if they could get out more, and we don't have a whole lot of capacity for that ourselves, put on events, even attract, try to get people out and educate. Like, if you have a gravel wetland, here are some things you need to look at, so that the people who are closest to these systems and should feel the most ownership. Like, this is our thing, whether we like it or not. It's here. We got to maintain it. That's just a thought. I know that's a little bit like, we have to first get to the point of forming utilities, but I hope that's thought of here with that educational component.
Those SEMSWAT people were doing that, right?
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah.
A lot. So. Okay, so we're at 3:30. We kind of have another 20 minutes before wrap up. So Gianna, do you want to pose another one of the core questions and see what we get?
Yeah, sure. I knew backup questions would help for one of these meetings. It's the first time we've had time for it. It's so exciting. And we can go back to this discussion too, but really appreciate it. Let's see. Scrolling down. Oh gosh, we've got so many. I think we will go to we laugh now, but Where is the core questions list? Do. Oh no, team. Where is our core questions list?
They're not in the materials, I guess.
Oh no, found them. Okay. Oh no, they're not in the materials. No, I'm sorry. This is
Okay.
internal notes about which one we would bring forward and use the majority of today's time for. But maybe this might be you were already starting to talk about it, Zach. So maybe this is fruitful now. What do we mean by equity? What does equity look like for Vermonters when you think about who must participate in a utility, who can participate and who can't, who must pay in, who can't, who shouldn't? And you're thinking about pre-existing treatment, modern operating permits. What do we mean by equitable in terms of who's in and who's out, revenue raising, who can offload their permit obligations or not?
Can I go? I can't raise my hand again.
Oh yes,
Go
please.
ahead. Yeah, go Zach. Go ahead.
My personal take on this is it's everybody's responsibility here, right? So to me, I feel like we should be equitably putting the burden on everybody, right? So if you have an acre, like it feels like the utility model where people are paying in based on impervious area is an equitable way to manage stormwater. Whereas when we look at meeting the limit of just the 3-acre sites, that's not very equitable. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we were looking at a stormwater utility in Montpelier. And, you know, the reasons that it was the benefits that it was going to serve us were, you know, for infrastructure, equity, everybody was paying in, you know, phosphorus reduction, all of the components. So that's just my 2 cents on that.
So Zach, is that every impervious surface? Like, is that every owner's impervious surface, or is it a subset of owner's impervious surface? Example, would you include sort of farms in that impervious surface or not, insofar as farms have their own set of water quality requirements that they're implementing on? Or would the wastewater treatment plant, for example, even though that's municipal?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I mean, I guess Montpelier doesn't have farms to deal with, but my first reaction to that is, you know, even I guess a farm is regulated in a different manner, but if their barn had an acre of impervious area, like why would they be not subject to paying the same sort of, you know, base fees? I mean, what we were looking at in Montpelier was that, you know, anything below an acre was a flat rate and it was a very small amount. And then above and beyond there, it was tiered up accordingly based on impervious area. So everybody paid, but if your limit was smaller, then it was a really small amount. So that's just my initial reaction to your question.
Okay, thank you. Before we go to you, Jenny, Catherine, can I ask you a question? Do you have memory? There was an issue in St. Albans Town around this topic, right, of whether farms were in or out of the stormwater utility?
Yes, there was. It was one of many issues. But I believe from the farm perspective, there was a recognition that although they may have impervious, they have a lot of land that is used for the non-point stormwater treatment through runoff and capture and floodplain, and whether it was fair to charge them the same as, say, a residential property owner whose backyard wasn't serving all those same functions.
Right. Some of them will have acres and acres of impervious. And I think they approached the General Assembly to get something done about that, which was an existential threat to St. Albans Town's stormwater utility. And Zach, that's why I brought it up. It's like a little bit of a knotty situation, but still, Okay,
While I have the floor, in
please.
terms of equity, I do agree that from an equity perspective, the more you can spread the costs, the better. I don't know that we need a stormwater utility to achieve that. The way we fund stormwater now is through general collection of taxes and fees. And so I think we're achieving that now and would want to make sure that we don't make that worse. And in fact, now we have people other than Vermonters paying.
Rooms and meals, SGs, property transfer tax. That's where the dollars for stormwater control largely
And
come
those
from.
are
And some federal.
broad-based fee and tax collections. And so we're, I think, already achieving
Yep.
some equity in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that was part of the treasurer's report from Act 138 way back when, right? That was why the decisions were made to focus on those. Okay, Jenny, go ahead.
Yeah, I do think there's a bit of a I don't know, like an Escher diagram. If you say a wastewater treatment facility counts as impervious when its whole purpose and the whole reason that it's there is to treat the wastewater, and similarly with agriculture. And I guess for me, the definition of everybody that is more equitable is more going down to the smaller areas that are below 3 acre and saying, yeah, if you have impermeable surface and you don't fall into another category where you're already making your own reductions that are specific to your sector, then that would be when you get included in everybody.
So you would be looking at essentially regulated and unregulated sites, impervious sites, right? They would be
that would be a way if you were trying to look at the universe of equity. But I mean, I think that you certainly can draw a distinction in terms of size, because the choice to impact greater than 3 acres is a choice that was made by somebody at some time associated with the construction of that impervious surface. So, and while you can say that 3 acres is arbitrary, you might also have someone who just absolutely minimized their impacts, their stormwater impacts on a site, and it is below 3 acres. And so, yeah, complicated question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. But translating, so, impervious surface that's inside the waste load allocation, for example, vis-a-vis impervious surface across all sectors of the TMDL is one way to think about, right? And I'm kind of doing this for the purpose of like the scenario building that Gianna is talking about, because I think those kinds of, the end members or the binary decision points, if it's this or if it's that, that's modelable, if you will, or that's kind of like can be assembled into the kind of model that I think Gianna's envisioning.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're talking about when you talk about the pink. I mean, it's basically looking at what the opportunities are within developed lands, and what opportunities do we have to start by looking at that before we get into the more complex situation of looking at different sectors.
Yeah, and part of one of my questions to Emily Shelley is like, how do we think about what's equitable, or what all these other sites might already be doing, is getting a sense of like, what are the other parcels that are subject to an individual permit or a more modern operational permit, new development. I'm butchering all these words. Terry's like, please stop saying stormwater permit words. But like, what are we carving out of here? As someone that's done like none of that, or we're starting afresh with everyone? So it's sort of, if sites have some version of treatment, is this just has to do with like a fee discount? Yeah, go ahead, Christine.
I would say yes, Gianna. And that was kind of the same way SEMSWA does it. That's the same way a lot of the MS4 utilities are set up, is that if you have a treatment practice, you still have to pay your stormwater utility fee, but you can get a reduction essentially for that fee if you have practices on your site.
Hmm.
And I would say that could apply as well to like ag or any other industry, that if you have impervious, that's not already part of a wrap or other practice. Maybe it's the farmhouse itself, right? Then there should be something there. There should be a contribution there because they use the roads just like we do. And and really the lake is the lake, and it's not just the lake. This is really, I know this is about phosphorus and 3 acres right now, but the way we started this whole conversation today is 100 and plus water bodies that are impaired across the state, that are going to continue one by one to get looked at and need to get cleaned up. It's not just Lake Champlain, and water is a resource for all of us.
I have a related question. So if you're talking about an impact fee or not impact fee, that's a stormwater term. If you're talking about a fee for impervious by parcel, is that fee assessed equally across the state, like X amount of impervious, X amount of fee, or would it vary by watershed? Because you're talking about watershed implementation.
Yeah.
And we have not talked about revenue versus expenses.
Yeah.
So a given watershed may have a ton more expenses, which means you may need to have a lot more fee generation in Basin 5 than you might need in Basin 8. So the fee may be equitable within a basin, but it may not be equitable between basins if you do a basin. So I just throw that on the table.
It's an interesting point.
And maybe you can, if you do a universal fee across the state to make that your baseline equity, there would be a gap, and maybe that gap can be addressed through grants, through some formula grant. Maybe there's a gap in some basins and that's covered by state funds. But I don't know. It gets complicated.
Now you just got me going, Barn. Okay. Any other thoughts on equity and what that means? Sarah Coleman.
I think one of the other challenges is also like a utility suggests that like you're paying in for the provision of a service, and thinking about how diverse the landscape in Vermont is across rural and urban and suburban areas. I'm just thinking back to like some surveys that I participated in grad school, where asking about stormwater runoff in rural places really doesn't resonate. And so the degree to which that can be tied to some benefit, and also being able to have it in an ideal world be sophisticated enough, if we're talking about a house on 5 acres and there's no way that runoff is leaving that property, then there's a way to acknowledge that. Or one of the other signals that we saw was more about, we don't have stormwater runoff, but we do have road washouts and erosion of our driveway. So that spoke to the opportunity need for education, but also just being able to be flexible enough to appreciate like what stormwater runoff is in the different landscapes that we're dealing with and points of intervention.
Catherine?
I'm going to do my skunk at the party role again and just question whether we should really spend a ton of time talking about whether a new regional or statewide fee would make sense and what it looks like, because do we actually even believe that implementing something like that has any chance at all of being politically feasible? I mean, I'm just going to throw that question out there, and I don't think political feasibility was one of the questions or the parameters in what we're looking at. But I mean, I think that there's there's a lot of complicated questions here. So I think when we start to look at these different models and spend time expanding on them and talking them through and think about the equity question, thinking about political feasibility is definitely something we should be thinking of. I mean, I don't think Vermonters are clamoring for a new fee right now or ever. And so if it really comes down to, this whole question really is coming down to, do we have enough money to pay for the stormwater requirements we have put upon ourselves? And the answer is no.
No.
And so we should really be thinking, well, then do we need to change the requirements we put on ourselves, or do we need to raise more money? And I'm sorry, I keep going back to these bigger questions, and all of these are great and interesting things to talk about, but it doesn't solve the fundamental question of where that more money would come from and is it politically feasible?
Yeah.
Sorry. Just want to throw that out there.
Jan, I'm going to jump in just real quick. It's okay, right? I mean, I spend lots of time down there, down in the building these days. And yes, the political feasibility of something like that could be very low. But I think that the Act 37 framers, so to speak, they wanted us to look at these issues and alternatives and more equitable ways of meeting those requirements. Because I think they could have taken the decision to basically say, well, you know what, 3 acre was a bad idea. Just figure it out, ANRDEC, right? So, but I hear you,
Well,
Catherine.
partially I didn't say that because you told them, please don't do that.
Well, it's true, because then enter EPA, right? Gianna.
Well, I know I appreciate you saying that too, Catherine, and please don't apologize for the commentary. It's very similar, I think, to what we're hearing in chapter 3 as well, is this idea of that we're trying to look for equitable, we're also looking for cost effective, and building a new revenue raising mechanism takes a cost. And so is there a question of evaluating currently what the state raises as enough and leaning in on existing mechanisms? So that might be something that we take as like part of one of the models to bring back to you all, is like, let's look at it from this perspective. If we expanded state revenue, let's look at it from this perspective if we launched a regional revenue. And so like trying to look at those different options, but trying to understand cost effectiveness and equity may go hand in hand sometimes, and may not go hand in hand sometimes. And then in terms of like, it's equitable to bill everyone with impervious surface, like sometimes goes counter to this idea of like incrementally phasing in this regional entity. Like if this was an entity that slowly took on operational permits over time, they may not immediately be billing they may not be providing a service to everyone within the watershed boundaries, and may not appropriately should be charging a fee to everyone for that matter. And so there's also that kind of rub of like phasing in, and then what a fee structure might look like based on those. And we're at 350.
Okay, you're right. We are. That was excellent discussion, though. A lot of interesting pieces. Team, do you feel like you have some framing to be able to like propose some like scenarios or models?
I'm looking at Gianna on the screen.
Okay.
I'm looking back at you, Chris. Mary, Terry.
Yes.
Yeah,
Say yeah. There you go. All right. Thank you, Terry.
Say yes.
Yeah. I feel like this was really helpful conversation. I think this, if our team feels like there's more follow-up, we can certainly bring it to the next study committee meeting. And just want to confirm consensus and comfort with the committee that we can preserve staff capacity over the next month to focus on some of these scenarios and put aside the work groups for right now. I think we've gotten the outlines as far as we can go for now. I see some thumbs up there. and we can come back to those once we have a better sense of a vision. And if there's any opposition to that, to please speak up.
I think it'd be nice to be able to, yeah, I mean, I want to have faith that it's going to be something that's workable coming back. I guess I'll say that I'd like to at least see that there's a one of those options being a watershed structured option, because I've heard that so much. I think having multiple avenues is good, or opportunity for us to continue to participate in some level.
So I was going to offer, Gianna, do you think that you all would have time to put your thinking caps around what these scenarios look like, but actually send the drafts out to the committee with a little bit of lead time so you all could react to them before we get together and start to like dive in and poke holes or say, oh, that's a cool idea, and here, this is a challenge and this is good?
I mean, I think that's our intent, to more than a day's notice of material to post and share material with you all. And that I don't think any of these are imagined as a final solution, but maybe just a way to represent all the different, maybe like as diverse of solutions as possible, so that people can pick from each of them what looks good, what feels good. And yes.
I mean, I think that's the kind of way I'm trying to say yes, and like, we don't know what they're going to look like, but I mean, I heard a lot of good feedback around the different scalar models, around the equity question, around the core. What are we trying to do here? So if we get those out to you with a week before the next meeting, I don't know if that's feasible or not, but we'll give it a ish. Then we can get some feedback back, like, oh, you guys totally missed. Go back to the drawing board, and then maybe we'll defer by a month or defer by a couple of weeks. But otherwise, keep it on the book and be ready to talk about this in a month. Gianna, is that all right by you? I don't want to commit to a timeline that doesn't work for you guys.
I like week-ish. That's a great commitment.
Week-ish. Okay. Yeah. All right. Any last part or any other public comment? I think we offer the opportunity for public comment at the beginning and the end, just in case something came up that prompted a thought. Claire?
Thank you. I have far more comments at the end than at the beginning. So I think I just have maybe
You're
three.
always welcome to raise your hand too, by the way, if you want to speak during the meeting. So.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, but go ahead.
I guess so. Three just general observations that I guess are maybe seconding some things that were offered before. But the first thing is I really I have a nagging concern in the back of my mind that as we move forward with this effort, we really want, it would be beneficial to have a robust understanding of how work currently happens here in the state and our current entities that are involved in doing this work, our current funding structures, all of that. Because right now we do have 3 county scale entities that are named in statute as being part of the tactical basin planning process, and that do quite a bit of this work: the technical assistance to municipalities, the project identification, development, evaluation of phosphorus reduction, project ranking. All of that is happening on the non-regulatory side of things by the regional planning commissions, the natural resource conservation districts, and the watershed groups. So just to offer that there are already structures in place and people doing this work. And so one of the questions might be, how do we leverage the pre-existing systems into the regulatory space efficiently, as opposed to creating new structures and systems, and what the barriers are for those entities in doing more of this work. Because I think there is a lot of unleveraged potential with our existing structures. And so I think that would be good to keep in the back of our minds. The second thing I just want to second, I guess, is I do think we should always be evaluating the efficiency of a regional entity versus a state entity. In Vermont, we're so small. My default is actually usually it's most efficient to do things at the state level. My day job, I support 14 regional local or regional government entities, and I know how very hard it is to operate at that scale, to fund those entities and to, you know, do everything that's required to make them operational. So my default is the state level is usually most efficient, but there may be very good reasons to locate certain responsibilities at the regional level. I think we just need to articulate those very clearly against why it makes more sense regionally than at the state level. And then I guess I think you are well aware that this is happening in parallel, but the state does have a county and regional governance study committee. And I am hoping that some of these questions can be brought to them, because I think there are three needs, or three, I guess, gaps in general purpose government here in Vermont that may be overlaps. One obviously is the ability to raise taxes at the county scale. The other is operations and maintenance of public structures at the county scale. And the third, which is not and never popular and has not been brought up here very much, and I don't think I'd like to, but eminent domain. And I think the reason of those three is not just because they're gaps in and of themselves, but because they relate to eligibility for certain funding streams, federal funding streams that can address water issues. So just to plug that, happy to talk more about that, but those are the three things I just wanted to put in the back of your mind before we head out the door. So, thank you.
Thank you, Claire, very much. Appreciate that. I might want to chat with you about that third item at some point when I run into you, but no rush.
Happy to.
Yeah. Harry Shepherd.
I would just like to say that I hope that you guys are able to keep a broader vision. You got a whole cloth here to work with, and I understand how complicated some of the existing things are. When I was hearing the struggles about like how to finance it, how to collect, and going through towns, I say to myself that there's potential solutions depending on how you all choose to structure this. One of the things I've been promoting with our little group is that if these regional utilities were established as municipalities, they should have a sufficient size and scope and ability so that they don't need to bill through individual towns. They don't need to collect fees from individual towns. They can condemn land if they needed to. They can go into the Vermont Bond Bank and secure debt financing to try to do things. And if we can get to the point of actually having stormwater commissioners like we have for drinking water and clean water, kind of embedded in statute, that there's a lot of opportunity in the rate structuring mechanism that really water and sewer commissioners have quite a lot of flexibility with, where some of the challenges, like how to bring in, some of the 3-acre projects that have already been completed and compliant. Well, if they're able to maintain that permit and meet the water quality standards that we're striving for, maybe they have a reduced rate versus a property that has no real opportunity to implement any stormwater practices. They might have to pay a higher rate. And so I think that all of these, that there's a boatload of problems in trying to get our arms around all of the kind of existing conditions. But if we kind of keep our minds open and think through what the possibilities are for a regional stormwater utility, I think that many of those questions could be answered. And I'd like to also offer up is that if there were a Northeast Kingdom stormwater utility, they don't have the challenges that Chittenden County has. And so they should be able to manage, the stormwater goals with their own rate structure. I don't think it needs to be a statewide rate structure. I think that in fact would complicate it politically. If there's not a lot of runoff challenge from any particular stormwater utility that needs to be addressed, then I think that they might be able to be afforded the opportunity to have lower rates. And I struggle a little bit with this process because I think we're struggling conceptualizing, and we're trying to write chapters here, of what we're hoping for, but I'm not 100% convinced that we really have a conceptual idea of where we hope to take this. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. And I think that's literally what Gianna is using all of this input to have the team work on for our next meeting. So, and we'll see how close to the mark we got based on lacing together everything that we all heard. So, okay. And appreciating that it is 4:01, I declare us adjourned, and thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a great day.
Thank you.